This is me reading The Ethics by Spinoza. I'm just taking a video of myself reading it, and while reading it, I'm just going to try out loud to understand it. I've read this book before, but I'll be reading this book forever, trying to understand it. I don't really know why I'm taking a video or anything like that, what I'm going to do with it. I haven't really thought about any of that, so just kind of going to do it. I've already read I'm starting with part 1. I'm just starting right at the beginning of Spinoza's Ethics. This is it's the translation by Edwin Curley, Penguin edition, published in 1996. And if you don't know Spinoza was a modern philosopher in the 17th century, born in, I think, Amsterdam. He was a rationalist, and he wrote this book called The Ethics. He wrote this book for many years. It was never published in his life. It was only published after his death, and it's about, it has 5 parts. It's a philosophy book that follows 5 parts. Part 1, of God. Part 2, of the nature and origin of the mind. Part 3, of the origin and nature of the affects. Part 4, of human bondage, or the power of the affects. Part 5, the power of the intellect, or on human freedom. And it's written in what's called a geometric method. So the whole book is written as though it's kind of like a mathematical geometry book. So this is page 1, right? Yeah, page 1 of part 1. So as you can see, demonstrated in geometric order and divided into 5 parts. And then just like a geometry book would, or a math book, or whatever. I don't really read that stuff, but starts off with definitions, and then postulates some axioms, and then you can see on the right after the axioms, it just starts listing off propositions. That little P3 on that page, that means proposition. And below that you have demonstration, which is like a proof, like as though the proposition is a mathematical formula, the demonstration is a proof. And sometimes there's also corollaries, which are kind of adjunct propositions onto a main proposition. And sometimes there's also like a note, or I think he calls it a scholium, which is just like a further explanation or a note added on to the proposition. Anyway, that's a little intro into the ethics. I'm also drinking wine. It's Pinot Grigio Da Vinci. So. Alright, so as I said, I already read the definitions and axioms, so I'm just going to start with Proposition 1 in Part 1. It's probably inappropriate. I probably should go read the definitions, because the propositions follow from the definitions and the axioms, but I guess I'll read it. Whatever. So I'll read the definitions for this video. So, definition 1. By cause of itself, I understand that whose essence involves existence, or that whose nature cannot be conceived except as existing. So I think Spinoza is saying here that if something has caused itself to exist, what that means is that existence is within its essence. Essence is a kind of key word for Spinoza. It means the essence of something is that thing which makes that thing what it is, which sounds kind of obvious, but what it is it's the element or quality of a thing that if you were to take that quality away, you would thereby take the thing away itself. You would take the entire thing away as you take that quality away. That quality is necessary for that thing to be what it is, as opposed to some ancillary quality that isn't really necessary for it being what it is. So an example that I've heard, I don't remember if this was Spinoza's example, I think it was, in a different work, was that the essence of a hill is when you have ground surrounded by lower ground. That quality of a hill is necessary for that hill to be a hill. That hill might be made of grass or it might be made of dirt. It doesn't really matter. That's a quality that is not part of its essence. So anyway, I just realized I'm going to try to go through all these definitions with that much explanation. Yeah, I don't think so. It's going to be a pretty long video if I do that. We'll see how far I get. It's already 7 minutes, so. Hopefully that makes sense. So he says, in that definition, or he says, by cause of itself I understand that whose essence involves existence, or, so kind of a different way to formulate the definition, a cause of itself, that if something is self-caused, its nature cannot be conceived of except as existing. I was trying to word that differently than he did. That's why it was kind of choppy. But it says, that whose nature cannot be conceived except as existing. As far as I'm concerned, nature and essence are synonymous terms in Spinoza. I don't really know if that's the case. I think that's the case. So, yeah, I probably should have talked about this in the intro or something, but I'm just some guy reading this book. I'm not an expert or anything. Far from it. Definition 2. That thing is said to be finite in its own kind, that can be limited by another of the same nature. For example, a body is called finite because we always conceive another that is greater. Thus, a thought is limited by another thought. But a body is not limited by a thought, nor a thought by a body. So, I think definition 2 by Spinoza here is a little ambitious because he's talking about things he hasn't really explained yet. But nevertheless, it's true, I guess. Or, I mean, he's going to get to it, all that stuff. But let's look at the first part. That thing is said to be finite in its own kind that can be limited by another of the same nature. So, finite in its own kind. Here's what I take that to mean. I'm pretty sure what Spinoza means is something that is finite, which is to say it's not infinite, it's limited, it's been conditioned by other things. And then when he says in its own kind, I think he just means something that takes up a certain attribute. So a finite body, as he says, an extension. Its kind is extension. It is a body with an extension. I think that's what he means when he says in its own kind. I could be wrong, I don't really know, because he doesn't really say that term in other places, I don't think. So he says something is finite if it can be limited by another of the same nature. That's kind of what I said when I said if it's conditioned by something. So in the world of extension, I guess we haven't really got to what extension is yet, but extension is the physical world to Spinoza. So this bookmark, which is the bookmark I'm using to mark my place in this book, it is finite in its own kind, meaning it is limited, constrained, or conditioned by other things within its kind, namely extension. It is limited by other things in extension. Okay, recording resumed after a brief intermission. I don't really remember what I was saying. I think I kind of went through the first part already of definition 2. So I'll move on to what he says after that, which is, for example, a body is called finite because we can always conceive another that is greater. Thus, a thought is limited by another thought, but a body is not limited by a thought, nor a thought by a body. So, I already, I was talking about this bookmark and how it's a finite thing in its own kind, meaning it exists in extension or the physical world. So this thing exists in the context of other things that are greater. So Spinoza says a body is finite because we always conceive another that is greater. So, it exists in this room with all the other objects, and that's greater, but it also exists in all of space, which is a lot greater than this one little bookmark. This bookmark, it doesn't weigh a lot. It's very thin. So there are a lot of other things about this bookmark that limit its existence. It doesn't take up all of the attribute of extension. But yeah, as I said earlier, he's reaching a little bit because he's talking about things that he hasn't really defined yet. But he says a thought is limited by another thought, but a body is not limited by a thought, nor thought by a body. It gets a little hazy here for me because thought, so in the world of thought for Spinoza, in the attribute of thought, the particular things are ideas, as opposed to the particular things being objects in the world of extension. So a particular thing in the world of extension is this glass of wine, and a particular thing in the world of thought is the idea of this glass of wine. But I say it gets a little hazy for me because I can't really think of thoughts that are greater than other thoughts. He says thoughts are limited by other thoughts, which I guess he could mean that some thoughts can only occur if other prior thoughts have occurred before they occur. Those ideas are dependent on other ideas. I guess that's kind of the same as saying that the other ideas or the prior, requisite ideas are bigger. They contain the idea that you're trying to explain, I guess, or the idea at hand, or whatever. That's my attempt, I guess. Okay, we're already at 16 minutes. I'm going to try to get through. Well, definition 3 is a pretty important one, I guess. So I'll try to get through 3, 4, maybe 5. 7 and 8 are just too long. So definition 3, by substance. Oh, I forgot to say something about definition 2. There's a last sentence in definition 2 which says, but a body is not limited by a thought, nor a thought by a body. So, physical objects don't affect ideas in the world of thought, and ideas in the world of thought don't affect physical objects in the world of extension, or the attribute of extension. That's probably pretty obvious. An idea can't affect a physical thing. But every physical thing has a corresponding idea, and every idea has a corresponding physical thing. But, as I said earlier, he hasn't really explained any of this, so it's not really worth going through all that. Definition 3. By substance, I understand what is in itself and is conceived through itself. That is, that whose concept does not require the concept of another thing from which it must be formed. So, substance is a big word in Spinoza's system. And it's kind of subtle, but he says it here probably the most simplistically you can say it, because it really is pretty simple. It's just not the usual way we think about things. So, a way that people define substance outside of the way Spinoza does here is that substance is the totality of everything, and substance is also the power or force that brings the totality of everything into existence. The force of existence, or the power of existence itself. And that power or force brings things into existence. According to Spinoza, it brings an infinite amount of things into existence. We'll see that later on when Spinoza has this concept of natura naturata and natura naturans, which is kind of what I just said. But that explanation is right, but actually that's an explanation which is derived from this explanation. That explanation follows from this explanation. This explanation is a little more philosophically literal, and it gets right down to the foundation of that prior explanation, but they're both true. I don't really know why Spinoza doesn't say it in the other way. He does allude to that sort of explanation in other places, I guess, but so if something is in itself, we just talked about things that are finite because they are within or they are limited by other things. So a precondition of this cup is the attribute of extension, or the physical world. It is within the physical world, obviously. Thought, it is within the mind, or the world of thought. And Spinoza says, he'll say later on in a few pages, that extension and thought are the only two attributes that humans have access to. And he seems correct in that. I mean, personally, I don't have access to any other world other than extension and the world of thought. Perhaps there's other ways. I mean, you got to remember, this is a metaphysical system. It's not some sort of scientific discovery. So there could be other ways to categorize how we experience reality, but this is probably the best way to parse it. Just two broad: physical world, mental world. Descartes does the same thing. What was I getting onto with that? Anyway, Spinoza says there could be infinite attributes. And that's what I was going to say. These attributes they don't have anything in common with one another, as Spinoza already said. A thought doesn't have anything in common with an idea. I misspoke there. An idea doesn't have anything in common with a body. The world of thought doesn't have anything in common with the world of extension. We said, we didn't say earlier, this is something he says in the Axioms. I forgot, that's something I already read. But anyway, for something to be in something else, those two things need to have something in common. So the space in which this cup exists and this cup both have extension in common. And so the fact that this cup is contained within extension makes sense because they have extension in common. But if something is contained within itself, then it doesn't have anything in common with anything else. Its existence is not dependent on anything outside of itself. And the reason why substance is the totality of everything is because if that is the case, the only thing that could apply to a thing like that is everything that exists. Because if you pick out a particular thing that exists, whether it's one cup or the entirety of the physical world, then you are implicitly or explicitly saying that the existence of that thing depends on something outside of it. As we saw earlier, it's pretty obvious. The cup with the wine in it exists on many things. It exists on the chemical constitution of the wine, the materials of the cup, this sort of stuff. And philosophically, it depends on a physical world in which other objects exist. And the physical world itself is dependent on what? Well, Spinoza says substance. And what he means by that is existence, pretty much. An attribute. The only thing an attribute has in common with another attribute is that they both exist. They don't have anything else in common. And if they have existence in common, then they both depend on something prior to those attributes for their existence. And that is what Spinoza calls substance, which is pretty much synonymous with the word existence. Everything that is exists. That's kind of logically redundant. Obviously, if something is, it exists. But something that may be a little more easy to miss is, an implication of that is that every single thing, whether it's a speck of dust on someone's boot in Ukraine, or my mustache right here, the materials that make up this mustache. Those two things, which are worlds apart for all intents and purposes, have existence in common. It's a kind of binding quality that those two things have. It's kind of obvious, but it is obvious. But Spinoza definitely extracts all the logical implications of what follows from that. So the concept of substance is something that is in itself, meaning it doesn't have anything else that it depends on, which means that it is everything, because there is nothing outside of it. If there's nothing outside of it, then substance is everything. Then he says, what is in itself and what is conceived through itself. Well, that's a little obvious from everything I've already said, right? The actual being of substance is not dependent on anything else, and the concept or the conception of substance is also not dependent on any outside concept, because nothing exists outside of everything, obviously. So he reiterates it. That is, that whose concept does not require the concept of another thing from which it must be formed. And that is pretty much what I already said. That's going to be pretty important throughout the rest of the book, and you'll see why in the next few definitions. But if I did the next few definitions, I'd be here for another 30 minutes, which is how long this video is. And I think I've beat the lights out of the definitions I've already done. I don't know if I can say another word about them. I've explained them so much. But this is just my understanding of them so far. I could be wrong. I have no idea what is going to happen with this video. It's either going to sit on my computer and be shown to a select few, or I'm going to upload it. I don't really know. I'm kind of getting the inkling to maybe just take videos of me reading through Spinoza or other philosophy and just trying my best at understanding it, and putting my efforts up on YouTube, because I got a twinge of narcissism in me, apparently. Anyway, that's about it. See ya.